Hello, everyone. Welcome to Unit 4. What is consciousness? These three readings that I picked are sort of. So I think the first two, Nagel's piece, what is like it is like to be a bat, or what is it like to be a bat, and Chalmers' piece, consciousness and its place in nature, are taking a sort of skeptical view that a physicalist account of the mind is going to be possible. Chalmers' piece is mostly outlining the sort of landscape of the debate so far, and Nagel is presenting this really interesting and I think important difficulty for accounts of reduction. But Prince's piece, on the other hand, is I think a really cool philosophical paper that utilizes the empirical work in this area much more than the other two are, and has some actually cool preliminary answers to really important questions about consciousness. And Prinz is perhaps famous for, or not famous, but he's known for giving these sort of succinct answers to really difficult questions and then defending them at length and doing so quite well, I think. So we have a nice breadth of types of theorists and philosophers that we're reading in this section. But let's start quickly with this What Is It Like to Be a Bat by Thomas Nagel. So, Nagel's principal argument or principal point is that the project of reduction is going to be unhelpful in understanding consciousness and understanding experience. So, a lot of physicalists love examples of reduction like water is H2O. So, we have this ordinary observation of what water is, and science and chemistry have helped us to understand the physical and chemical composition of water, such that we now have this reduction of water to these more fundamental units of H2O. And reduction in general is trying to take a sort of higher level concept or a concept that might not be empirically useful and reducing it to more fundamental units or more fundamental descriptions that can be useful in a physical theory. Of course, now that we know water is H2O, we can use water as a sort of placeholder for H2O in empirical theories. But prior to knowing this, what water was made up of, a reduction was certainly helpful. So, what's different about conscious experience for Nagel is this subjective element of conscious experience. So there's a what it's like of experiencing. I've talked about this a little bit before, but I think it's really useful just to think about your own experience. There's a what it's like of, say, looking at red, or a what it's like of hearing a dog bark, or what it's like of tasting a cold beer or something. And all of these subjective elements of conscious experience are first person, so they're from your own point of view, and it's very hard to describe those types of experiences without just saying, it just is what red looks like, or it just is what beer tastes like. Taste and maybe to some extent noise and even certain areas of vision, there are objective elements of it, right? We can explain shapes, or we can explain lines, or we can explain angles. But behind those sort of universal features of experience, there is a sort of qualitative feel of experience that's very hard to communicate in a public language sort of way. So, to help illustrate this point, Nagel asks us to imagine or to think about a bat and their subjective experience. So a bat primarily uses really complex mode of perceptual presentation and echolocation. So they send off sound signals and it bounces off structures and surfaces in the environment. And this provides the bat with an idea of their environment. And indeed, for a lot of bats, it's a highly accurate one. They can catch prey in the middle of the air at great speeds. They can coordinate their flight path to avoid obstacles, to avoid maybe even predators themselves. And it's a very complex perceptual mechanism that is quite unlike anything we have. We might initially be inclined to think that it's something like sight and it's just a different way of seeing. But we have to remember that Nagel's crucial point is that, look, when we're imagining what it's like to be a bat, we're imagining ourselves, we're imagining our own subjective experience and sort of transplanting it into what a bat is experiencing. So um, we can imagine what it would be for us to be a bat, but Nagel says it's still very different than imagining what it is like for that bat. So we can't sort of get at that experience by imagining our own perceptual experience stuffed into this, bat-like experience or bat-like body. And if we do try imagine, like, say we take away our sight, we take away a lot of our human appendages, we take away a lot of our other perceptual mechanisms, and start replacing them with a bat's, Nagel says at some point we're not able to even imagine what that's like, and indeed it'd be rather arrogant, perhaps is not the exact right word, but it'd be weird to think that we could do that because the physical makeup of a bat is so radically different from our own that we can't possibly know what it's like to experience it. And we can even think about this within human experiences, right? If you try and imagine what it's like to be blind from birth, this is extremely difficult. A lot of times when we're trying to imagine what it's like to be blind, we might close our eyes, but even when we close our eyes, we're still having this black visual experience before us, or like I think it's called brain gray experience. And we still have some sort of visual phenomena that is in our own, phenomenal experience of the world or of our environment. But being blind is not like seeing black all the time, right? It's something very different. And to try and imagine what it's like to be blind from birth is incredibly hard. And I think there's a lot of empirical work that shows we can't sort of just imagine what it's like to have these disabilities. And if that's true within human species, we can imagine that difficulty and that perhaps impossibility of imagining it is going to be magnified by a lot when we try and do it within cross-species comparisons. So the subjective character of experience is not captured by any project of reduction, according to Nagel. This is for two reasons. First, the physical structures that make up any reduction, say like the human brain, it seems logically compatible to imagine that we could have a human brain but without any of the qualitative experience or the what it's like of experience. We can imagine ourselves as sort of organic robots that act and behave in the same way we do, but don't have any sort of qualitative what it's like experiences as a first-person subject. And Nagel says the logical compatibility, even if we might think that there's something physically hard to imagine about that, the logical compatibility of it suggests that reduction is going to have a hard time describing that subjective character of experience. And there's a similar worry about describing it in terms of functional or intentional states, so like beliefs, desires, etc. If we try and analyze them in terms of those states, then we can also ascribe those states to robots who behave exactly like us but have no internal states. So we can imagine robots that are acting exactly like us but don't have any internal states. In fact, I think this is what a lot of people imagine when they think of robots. They think of like they're acting exactly like us and they're behaving exactly like us, but they don't have any sort of like conscious experience like human beings do. And therefore, a project that tries to reduce them in terms of functional or intentional states is still consistent with the idea that we don't have any internal states and there is no subjective character of experience. So facts about subjective character of experience can only be known through a certain point of view. They cannot be observed in the physical operation of the organism for those reasons that we just talked about. But objective facts are observable physical facts. So for example, when you're thinking about other projects of reduction, like water is H2O. H2O is an observable physical fact. We can see the two hydrogen molecules or atoms or whatever, and the oxygen molecule or atom, and we can see those combining to form water. And this is something that is public and it's observable. It's not anything first person about observing those things. That's part of the beauty of science, right? Is that other people can test the theories and hypotheses we have about the external world and see if their own observations and their own experiments support or maybe detract from the previous experiments and observations. So this alone is not an argument against reductionism, but it does raise a significant problem. So in cases of successful reduction, we move towards a greater objectivity. So maybe there's some when thinking about what water is prior to knowing it was H2O, there might be some debate about things that count as water. Maybe there's clear viscous liquids, and people were like, well, we don't really know whether or not that's water. We don't typically call it water, but we don't have any principled way of ruling it out. But once we get, say, a chemical composition of water, now we have a definitive tool that can be used by anyone to pick out water from non-water. Or think about from the color red to wavelengths of light in a certain range. What counts as red is going to be pretty dependent on, if you're just thinking about the color, the phenomenal experience of red, it's going to be pretty viewpoint dependent. But if we have a tool to measure wavelengths of light in a certain range, we can definitively call something red. But this model doesn't seem like we can follow this model from less objectivity to greater objectivity with regard to experience. It doesn't seem like we can leave the human viewpoint behind because it's so crucial and integral to the character of subjective experience. And so Nagel's proposal is to try to think about experience more clearly before trying to define it by a physical theory or for a physicalist theory. I think Nagel's point here is a crucial one, and it's a good one, that reduction faces this huge problem of, especially with regards to experience, in aiming for greater objectivity. But I think there's a problem, and subsequent philosophers, I think, have picked up on the problem with Nagel's proposal is it's not exactly clear how we are supposed to do this. If we're merely sort of supposed to introspect about the subjective character of our experience, it seems like that's what we've been doing in philosophy of mind for its entire history. And while this has produced some neat insights like we saw in Descartes, it's not clear that it's going to get us much further in solving the mind-body problem. And Nagel realizes this himself and says, look, eventually we're going to reach a blank wall, but he thinks we can do better than we are currently. I'll leave that up to you guys to think about, how much better we can do than some of the philosophers we've been reading, and especially will read in the following units. But I do think that Nagel's point about this subjective character of experience that seems hard to capture in reduction is an important one and one worth thinking about. Okay, so now we'll move on to Chalmers' piece. Chalmers has this very long piece, and it starts with these arguments that are typically lobbed against materialism. And next unit, we're going to look in detail at the Mary argument, that Frank Jackson's, what Chalmers calls the knowledge argument. Briefly, the argument goes something like this. Mary is a neuroscientist who specializes in the visual experience of color. She knows all of the physical facts about the brain, all of the physical facts about wavelengths of light, and knows everything about there is to know about color vision and color properties in the world. So she knows all the physical facts. But Mary has been stuck in a black and white room her entire life. Perhaps she even gets maybe she just gets implanted with glasses that only allow her to see in black and white. She never sees shades of color. So she knows all the physical facts about color and about color vision, but doesn't know what it's like to see red. Now, she knows what goes on in the brain when someone sees red. She knows what kind of judgments someone is predisposed to make when they see red, but she doesn't. She's never seen red herself. And Jackson's original argument says, well, when she does encounter for seeing red for the first time, maybe she gets those glasses or implants taken out, or she exits the black and white room. When she sees red for the first time, Jackson says, she must be learning something new. When she sees a red apple, she's learning what it's like to see red. And it can't be that she's learning anything physical, because she's already learned all the physical facts. Therefore, materialism can't give a complete account of consciousness, because it leaves out whatever it is that Mary learns when she sees red. Now, we'll talk about this in great detail next unit, but it's useful to at least have that picture going forward, because Chalmers returns to it when he's talking about each of these views. So, in the discussion board post for this week, I'm asking you to pick one of these views that you find most compelling, and maybe explain why you find it compelling. I'm interested to see where people fall on the spectrum. So type A materialism is typically associated with views called eliminativism or analytic functionalism, etc. So it denies the hard problem. It denies this gap between the explaining the phenomenal and explaining the physical. It says once we've sort of explained the cognitive, behavioral, and environmental functions, we have really explained everything there is to know about consciousness. To some extent, I think Prins actually falls under type A materialist. There's going to be some debate about where exactly each person is going to fall, but I think he's a good example of this. He says, look, we have these questions about consciousness, and once we answer them, we've sort of answered all of the mysteries that we can about consciousness. There's no leftover fact about how to explain this like subjective character of experience. The problem with this view, according to Chalmers, is that it seems to deny the manifest or the obvious, that we do have this subjective flavor of experience, and that it is important that we describe it in a physicalist theory. I think there are good defenses on behalf of the type A materialist. One in your text is from Daniel Dennett, and if you're really interested in this, I would. And normally in a longer class, I probably would have assigned this piece, but his piece Quining Qualia that's in the textbook is an interesting defense of this view, that maybe we're not denying something that is so manifestly obvious as Chalmers thinks it is. But Chalmers' point is that, look, it sure seems like we have a subjective character of conscious experience, like Nagel points out, and if a view is going to deny this, that's a really heavy burden to take on, because it seems like we need an explanation of what that is. Type B materialism is typically associated with identity theory. So they say, look, there is an epistemic gap, but there's no... so epistemic is like a knowledge gap, but there is no ontological gap or existence gap. Everything's physical, but there's an epistemic gap between the phenomenal and the physical. So Mary might know all the physical facts, but she could not know about red. And that's because there is this epistemic gap between the phenomenal, what its likeness of seeing red, and the ordinary physical facts that we associate with the color and color processing. The problem with this view is that there does seem to be a different sort of epistemic gap than we would normally think about. So water is identical to H2O, but we could know everything there is to know about water without ever experiencing it. We don't learn anything new about water by, say, dipping our hand in it, according to this view. You can know all you know about water, about how it reacts to different substances, about its chemical composition, etc., by just knowing all of those facts. but you don't have that similar level of say mastery or complete knowledge with something like red. And that's sort of the intuition that's at work behind this Mary thought experiment, is that there is this deeper epistemic and perhaps an even ontological gap between the color experience of red, or the phenomenal experience of red, and the physical facts about color, about red. So type C materialism is sort of this maybe what you'd call hopeful materialism or Mysterianism. There's a deep epistemic gap, and one that we currently do not know how to close, but it can be closed in principle. There's a lot of reasons for taking this type C materialism. Some say, like, look, we just don't have the conceptual wherewithal as human beings. We don't have we're not made up. Colin McGinn has this idea that we're not sort of constituted as human beings to understand this sort of thing of how the physical and phenomenal relate to each other. We might be able to in the future, some of the people that are fans of type C materialism say, but there's no ontological gap. Everything's physical. We just don't understand this deep epistemic gap between the phenomenal and the physical. Chalmers' problem with type C materialism is that it seems to collapse into one of the other views. I'm going to read a section from 260 because I think it's useful in describing this. So Chalmers says at the bottom of 260, ultimately it seems that any type C strategy is doomed for familiar reasons. Once we accept that the concept of consciousness is not itself a functional concept, and that physical descriptions of the world are structural, dynamic descriptions, there is simply no conceptual room for it to be implied by a physical description. So, the only room left is to hold that consciousness is a broadly functional concept, after all, so accept type A materialism. Hold that there is more in physics than the structure and dynamics, so accept either type D dualism, which we'll come to, or type F monism, or hold that the truth of materialism does not require an implication from physics to consciousness, so accept type B materialism or identity theory. So Chalmers says, look, depending on why you think the epistemic gap is so difficult, you're going to end up in one of the other camps anyways. So maybe there really isn't room for this type C materialism. Okay, so type D dualism is interactionism by Descartes. This is substance dualism. We've talked about this a lot, so I don't want to go over it too much, but two substances, physical and mental, different substances that nonetheless interact. So the obvious problem that we've talked about is how these very radically different substances are supposed to interact with each other. Chalmers has this sort of, he goes on this defense of interactionism by an appeal to quantum mechanics or physics. I think it's sort of wrong-headed, but the issue is really deep, and it's too far afield from what we're doing here. But he thinks at least maybe interactionism isn't as bad or off on the wrong foot as many people would think. But regardless, type E dualism is actually the view that Jackson, as a result of Mary's thought experiment, comes to adopt. And this is called epiphenomenalism. So it's the view that phenomenal properties are ontologically distinct from physical ones, but they don't causally interact with physical ones. So they avoid the very sort of spooky or weird problem of type D dualism and how these properties interact by saying, oh, they don't causally interact. They're just sort of epiphenomenal. They come out of physical properties and they're ontologically distinct from them, but they don't interact. There's a deep unintuitiveness to epiphenomenalism that causes a lot of people to reject it. So an example of a phenomenal property on epiphenomenalism is, say, the pain from touching a hot stove. And remember that pain from touching a hot stove comes out of physical processes, so of the burning, the kinetic energy of the stove itself. Excuse me. But epiphenomenalism says, look, these phenomenal properties aren't causally efficacious in the physical world. So when I touch a hot stove, that pain doesn't make me move my hand. It's just sort of a byproduct, and it sort of the word I keep coming back to is epiphenomenal, because it comes out of this physical process, but it doesn't have any impact on my behavior, my thoughts, my beliefs, etc. This seems deeply counterintuitive. Surely part of the reason I move my hand away from a hot stove is because it hurts. Surely part of the reason I like drinking water is the way it feels when my throat is dry. Surely part of the reason I like listening to good music is the way the phenomenal presentation of the sounds. And this is a real difficulty for epiphenomenalism, and it's this deeply counterintuitive idea that the phenomenal properties don't play any causal role. Type F monism is the last one that Chalmers talks about. I think this is the view that Chalmers himself favors, and it's one that has sort of received a lot of attention in philosophy, but it's not always good attention. So panpsychism is the theory that at bottom, at the most fundamental units of reality, consciousness exists. So phenomenal properties are located at the fundamental level of physical reality. This is a monism, and it has some resemblance to materialism because it says, look, there's only one type of thing, but that type of thing also happens to be phenomenal. The reason that I think this view has been so look, I keep saying it's deeply counterintuitive, and of course, a view being deeply counterintuitive doesn't mean that it's wrong, and I want to make sure that's clear. But it does seem there is this deeply counterintuitive idea that rocks and trees and grass are, in some very real sense, have a phenomenal sort of perspective, or are conscious at some very minimum level. And this view sort of assumes that, because it says, look, phenomenal properties are sort of at the base or bottom of fundamental level of physical reality. And the one problem with this view is that deeply counterintuitive. But there's perhaps the most damning problem, I think, to my mind, is this combination problem. So assume that panpsychism is right, and phenomenal properties are sort of the fundamental units of reality. Rather than physical units, they just are these phenomenal ones. Our own conscious experience seems very unified, and it seems to have sharp boundaries, right? My experience doesn't sort of bleed into someone else's. It doesn't bleed into my cats who are behaving terribly right now. It doesn't bleed into anyone around me. It's very unified. It has sharp boundaries, and my experience presents itself as sort of one unified experience. But if the fundamental properties of reality are sort of phenomenal, it's hard to understand how those can combine into this unified experience. That's very difficult to understand. Okay, so that was a really quick overview of Chalmers' landscape. I really want you in the discussion section to sort of dive into one of those views that you're leaning towards and tell me why you like it. And don't be put off if I said something negative about your view. I tried to be as fair as possible. I definitely tried to hedge a little bit where Chalmers was more optimistic towards his own views. I tried to share a little bit of reason to be more doubtful than he was letting on. But I'll be interested to see what you guys have to say about all that. So Jesse Prinz is a nice counterpart to Chalmers. You can see he has these questions of consciousness, and he has really straightforward and relatively quick answers to them. He's not trying to downplay the difficulty, but he's sort of summing up a really wide body of research in this area that he thinks is giving us some preliminary answers to these questions. So the first question of consciousness is, what are we conscious of? So there's lots of processes going on in our brain. A lot of them are unconscious. What processes in our brain, or what representations that are being produced by our brain are we conscious of? Prinz's answer is, well, we can see, take visual representation. We can see it as a hierarchical system that is giving feedback to each other. So we get these really low-level properties, say of like density of spatial representation of maybe color at the very lowest level, and we get these very abstract representations that maybe give us more of an idea of the entire space. And when these combine into intermediate levels of representation, Prinz thinks that we're conscious of that convergence into these intermediate levels. It's a cool view, and I think especially a lot of work, I'm most familiar with work in visual experience or visual mechanisms in the brain. And I think there's a lot to be said for this idea of the brain working as this hierarchical system and somewhere in the middle producing this experience that we're conscious of. The next question Prinz tackles is how we become conscious. So how is it, what processes in the brain, or what is it about the mechanisms in our brain that allow us to become conscious? And this is where he has his air theory. He's very focused on attention. He's written a whole book on this idea that attention is integral or essential or necessary for consciousness. And his idea is that consciousness arises when these intermediate level perception representations, that is the what we are conscious of, are made available to working memory via attention. So there are lots of things in our visual experience that we're not conscious of. If you've ever done, I could show you some interesting things about like inattentional blindness, or these like tests like the invisible gorilla. If you've ever done that, there are a lot of things in our visual experience that we're not conscious of. And Prinz's idea is that these representations are made available to consciousness, or we become conscious of them through the modulation of attention. And it's when they're made available for working memory. Why are we conscious? So why not just have these big, why not be these robots or philosophical zombies where we have all the same behavioral and functional capabilities that human beings have, but we don't have any conscious awareness of it? Prinz's suggestion is that we need these viewpoint-specific representations to be broadcast to working memory in order to make decisions. So I need to be conscious of, like, let's say I walk and I'm taking a hike and I see a mountain lion. Part of my ability to react appropriately to this mountain lion is knowing which way that mountain lion is facing. Maybe if it seems like it's going to attack, if it seems aware of me, if it seems afraid of me, or if it seems like it's on edge. And these representations are crucial for me to make my next decision. And that's Prinz's suggestion for why we are conscious, rather than not having these representations available to us. Who is conscious, Prinz thinks, is one of the more difficult questions. So he thinks that higher mammals who are very closely related to us seem to have the same sorts of neural mechanisms, or roughly similar, so that we have a good reason to suspect that they are conscious. But very distantly related animals seem to resemble us in a lot of functional aspects. And this goes back to like this example of the octopus, right? And it's not clear how closely, because remember, for Prinz, consciousness just is this neurofunctional account. And it's not clear to Prinz how closely they need to resemble us in those functional ways in order to count as being conscious. So he thinks that's a really hard question, and I think people of all theories about consciousness have this really difficult question here. Excuse me, I need to learn to take breaths more when I'm speaking. I'm trying to get through it quickly, and I'm not breathing enough. And I think Prinz is highlighting an interesting way of going about it, but he realizes that there's still a lot more work to be done here. So as you saw, that's a nice, fast introduction to Prinz's own view, and I think it highlights a lot of the important work being done in these areas. And it's this more optimistic approach towards the empirical work that says, look, a lot of these questions are just going to be empirical questions at bottom. I'm still, I think there's still reason to recall the questions that Nagel is prodding the materialist with, and Chalmers is raising to some extent, about this subjective character of experience being inadequately captured by a lot of physicalist theories. And one might make the same complaints to Prinz, but these are really interesting and pressing questions even now in cognitive science and philosophy of mind that people are worried about. So I want you to go to the discussion board, pick one of those theories from Chalmers and write a little bit about why you find that view persuasive. If you don't find any of them at all persuasive, perhaps write about, just pick one at random maybe and defend it. It's a useful exercise in defending a view you might not totally believe just because you're unsure about the quality of the evidence. But take the quiz. As always, email me with any questions, comments, concerns. And we're almost through. We're about more than halfway now. So take a look at the paper topics that are up. That paper will be due before the end of the semester. It's a really short one, 1 to 2 pages. But I want you to have a little bit of a longer writing assignment than just the discussions. All right. Well, enjoy the rest of the unit, hopefully, and see you next time.